Hi, everyone. I don't know what you heard, but we'll be talking about Smiles as a Service today, a play in 3 acts. Like Krista said, my name is Christopher Hendrix. I am a senior software engineer working in our consulting practice at Labs, currently on a Cloud Foundry project. That's a lot of different things that I do at work just as part of my job title. It brings up questions about what is a software engineer? What does consulting mean in this context? What's Cloud Foundry and why am I working on it right now? So this leads me to go to a party, meet someone new, and they inevitably ask me, what would you say you do here? This is from Office Space, by the way. And whenever anyone asks me that, I'm always taken aback, at least for a second, until I compose myself. So I'd like to start this presentation with a mini exercise, and I want each of you to spend a second thinking about what you do at your jobs. All right. So I've been at Labs for 2 years now. So when someone asks me what I do for work, usually my answer looks a little bit something like this. This diagram that I pulled off of our Pivotal website details sort of the evolution of software from scoping it all the way to shipping it. So I'll often take things out of this when I'm talking to someone new. But some days my answer is things like, I write Rails apps, or I write Golang to write distributed systems, or I make wireframes in Sketch, or I write tests, I perform user research, I figure out business requirements. And some of you might have thought of those same things when we were doing that mini exercise. So the other day, I was thinking about this. I was thinking about how do I say what I do here at Labs. So I went to the job descriptions that we post on our website, because I wanted to see how what I felt was reflected in what Pivotal says that we do. So first I looked at the requirements, or the job description for a software engineer, and this happens to be a Cloud Foundry engineer, which I am not technically. But you can read this and see things like shipping features. It mentions things like writing tests. It mentions distributed systems and open source software. Next, I looked at a product designer. So the product designer talks about things like research, talks about things like prototyping, UI and visual design, talks about discovery and framing. These are all things that we do on a day-to-day basis. Next, I looked at product manager. Product manager talks about bridging business goals, talks about conducting interviews with stakeholders, managing a backlog, writing stories, and managing releases. So I read all these things and I was confused for a second. I was like, I see a lot of technical descriptions. I see a lot of in-the-weeds, day-to-day kinds of things that I perform. And I thought, okay, coming back to this question, what would you say you do here? I reflected on this again, and I was uneasy with all of these job descriptions. I felt like a huge part of my job was missing, but I couldn't necessarily put a finger on why. So I went and I thought about it a little bit further, and I tried to perfect what my elevator pitch was about what I do at my job. And I think I finally settled on, I help people write the software they need now, and I teach them how to write that software better in the future. And I think that's a pretty succinct description of my job. And I think it's one that aligns pretty well with the tagline of Pivotal Labs itself, which is, we transform how the world builds software. And this is a really bold claim. I want everyone to think for a second, like how bold of a claim it is to say, we transform how the world builds software. But I loved this tagline when I first looked at Pivotal Labs. It's one of the things that drew me here. I want it to be transformative. It's right there in the name. So that was cool. I went to the Pivotal Labs website, like I said, and I was looking around and I saw this, and it really reaffirmed, like, there's something there about transformation that I'm not seeing reflected. So I kept looking around our website, past our job descriptions, and I found things like this quote from John Dabrowski, who's a director of product at Refinery 29, says, right from the get-go, Pivotal Labs demonstrated how much they fundamentally cared about our product and needs, as well as the processing code. We were impressed by their excitement to work on hard problems with unique challenges and their executive input. I was like, okay, that's pretty cool. So I moved on, found another one. This one's from Ford. Ford said, employees help spread what I call the Silicon Valley culture, the culture of speed, collaboration, vision, and the value of technology to the rest of Ford. Internally, it's really about helping to move the culture forward. I thought that was pretty cool too. And then I finally found a blog post written by Rob Mee called Pivots Are What Sets Pivotal Apart. And in it, there's a fantastic quote that starts off by saying, while anyone can employ the pivotal approach, being a pivot means embracing the principles that are at the core of this approach. Pivots teach and learn from each other, demonstrating empathy, trust, respect, communication, feedback, and collaboration at every turn. I see empathy in there. I see communication, feedback, and collaboration. These are all really touchy-feely things that I didn't find in those job descriptions when I was talking to people or thinking about what I do on a day-to-day basis. That made me think, why am I thinking of my job in only these very highly technical terms? So I went back to my job description or my elevator pitch, and I thought about it again. And really the part that I focused on was I help people. In this case, I help people write software, but I do it in a variety of ways, and we all do it in a variety of ways. Technically, sure, but I also do a lot of feelings work. And I do that as part of being a consultant. I do that as part of being a successful pair and a successful team member. What I realized that how I felt every single day and how I made other people feel was as integral a part of my job as a consultant or as a productive agile team member as what I perform technically every single day. So here's an example of some of the things that I've had to do personally that wasn't captured in those job descriptions. I've had to help a client who was worried that they would be fired. I've had to de-escalate a tense, complex work relationship. I've had to help a new hire feel valued. I've had to teach a client who's becoming consistently more frustrated. And I've had to manage stakeholder expectations after a missed release. That's a lot of feelings work that wasn't ever captured in any of those job descriptions. So it brings us sort of to the end of the first section, with which I would like people to reflect. There's this difference between the 10-foot view and the 10,000-foot view when we look at what we do on a day-to-day job. I'd like you to reflect for a second on, do we consider our jobs or our work as only technical? And do we consider the feelings that we do or try and bring out in other people day-to-day as actual work? First intermission. So I'm going to introduce you to the term emotional labor and what it means and the research that has been done about it. But don't worry about that. I'm not going to leave you with just vocabulary terms. We're going to look at ways that Pivotal helps support people who perform emotional labor and ways that we could all do better. So emotional labor is a term that was coined by the sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild in her 1979 book, The Managed Heart, The Commercialization of Human Feeling. And in it, Arlie Hochschild did an extensive study of the company Delta, the airline company Delta, in which she looked at flight attendants and bill collectors in order to figure out what they do on a day-to-day basis. And what she found as performing these sorts of explorations is that not only were people performing physical work, such as lifting heavy boxes, people who were working in construction, doing things like that, not only was there cognitive work, which is things like what we do sort of on a day-to-day basis, thinking about software and creating software, but there was this third aspect of the labor that people were performing, which she termed emotional labor. And that emotional labor ends up being defined by sociologists these days as the complex interrelationship between organizational rules, the public displays that we perform about our emotions, and how we feel internally. So I'm going to give an example. McDonald's, as an organization, has an organizational rule saying that you must smile while you're at work, or when you're interacting with a customer, or when you're interacting with a peer. The public display that that person who works at McDonald's is performing is smiling. their inner emotions could range anywhere from being extremely happy and excited to being depressed, lonely, or apathetic. And the complex interrelationship between those three things represents the emotional labor that is being performed by that worker. You can think of it as coming, once again from Office Space, we need to talk about your flair. This is pretty poignant because this is a manager who is taking an organizational rule, which is about being happy, being smiling, and being empathetic, translating it into a public display, which is the display of flair, the display of a smile, and coming to talk to one of the workers about their own internal relationships, internal feelings, and how it's not matching the way that they are being perceived. So what happens when those things collide and intersect? So like I said, it's the complex interrelationship between these three things. When all of them are in sync with one another, we experience a term that's called emotional harmony. So if you personally are feeling great, you're feeling smiley naturally, and you're actually smiling, and that happens to be one of those organizational rules by your job or whatever organization that you're working on, you feel contentment, you feel emotional harmony. Nothing is going wrong. If there is some kind of dissonance between any of those three links, you experience what's known as emotional dissonance. There are two forms of emotional dissonance that have been studied, one of which is rules to emotion, so emotion-rule dissonance. So this is where your inner emotions don't align with what the organization has told people they need to behave or feel like. Or it's emotion-display dissonance, which is that the way that you're feeling internally cannot be translated, or you don't want to translate it into a public display. Okay? So a little bit of a review. We just learned about emotional labor, coined by Arlie Hochschild, which is the complex interrelationship between organizational rules, public displays, and inner emotions. We learned that when all three of these things match, you experience something called emotional harmony. We found out that when they don't match, we experience something called emotional dissonance. So this is a more in-depth reflection question. So I would actually like to take a little bit longer, but I would like you to think about the moments that you've experienced here at work where you have experienced emotional harmony and also experienced emotional dissonance, and think about the conditions that led you to each of these. Also, feel free to talk amongst yourselves. That might be a little bit hard for this big group. Okay. So, when we experience emotional dissonance, we feel like something has to change, right? We're being judged by the organization and by our peer groups according to how well we match these sort of organizational standards. So when we experience emotional dissonance and we want to make a change, we can do one of two things as studied by sociologists. And I call them fake it or make it. Faking it is what's known as surface acting. Surface acting is when you just attempt to change your outward display. You may still be feeling really sad on the inside, but you force yourself to smile while at work. There's another thing, making it, which is called deep acting. And deep acting is the process by which you attempt to change your inner emotions to more reflect the actual organizational rules. Right? Sociologists have studied these two behaviors, and they have found that there's a difference in how functional or healthy each of these two processes is. They've found that faking it, or surface acting, is highly dysfunctional for the employee. Trying to basically make a facade over what your actual feelings are is highly dysfunctional and leads to things like burnout, leads to things like attrition. Deep acting has also been studied, and it has been found to be at least functional. Now, I don't say healthy, because it's not the same as emotional harmony. Remember, emotional harmony only exists when all three of those pieces of the triangle, or interlapping circles, Venn diagrams, match. Deep acting is functional because it at least helps you change the bottom part as opposed to just masking it with a different surface display. So we just learned about surface acting, which is just changing your outward display to more better match organizational rules. And we learned about deep acting, which is attempting to change your inner emotions to help change those things. So another reflection time. And I would like you to think about when the last time that you actually performed surface acting or the last time that you performed deep acting. Right. Okay, so we've just learned sort of about what happens when you experience emotional dissonance. So let's analyze a little bit deeper what the three pieces, or how the three pieces that relate to emotional labor sort of interact with one another, right? We can think about each other and ourselves and wonder about whether or not each of us is performing the same amount of emotional labor as anyone else, right? Do certain people have a harder time performing this emotional labor? Do they either experience things differently, or is it harder for them to perform those displays, or does the organization itself have a different rule or standard for them? So, does anyone remember when this happened? Okay. So the tweet says, can we discuss Entertainment Weekly's picture of preference to represent Nikki versus Taylor in their last tweet or article? So there was a big hubbub, I want to say somewhere around a year ago, where Nicki Minaj and Taylor Swift were in a feud with one another on Twitter. And Entertainment Weekly decided to cover it, and at the very top of their article, they posted this picture, which does not portray them in the same light. It's really awkward. They ended up getting called out on it. They ended up retracting it and replacing it with a different picture. But why do I bring this up? When a company decides that empathy is a value and a requirement, the evaluations for different groups are not equal. Socially and culturally, stereotypes have a huge impact on the amount of emotional labor that people must perform, particularly at work. So, socially, we use the experiences of a cis white man as our default. So this is sort of a graph to help us think about what emotional labor is. So if you believe that your current emotional state, for instance, on some axis, kindness, currently exists down here, right? I'm feeling okay. Not great. When I come to work, I'm expected to be this kind. I'm expected to be this happy. The difference between those is the amount of effort that you must perform, the amount of emotional labor that you must perform in order to get from A to B. For women, social stereotypes perceive them to be naturally empathetic and kind. This has been studied by sociologists and psychologists for almost 50 years now. So the experiences of a white woman might look something like this. Their baseline is not the same as what is thought of for a white man. They're asked to perform the same amount of effort as our default, so their display rule ends up being unconsciously raised. But not everyone is naturally kind, and women are no different from men in this. They just have different stereotypes associated with them. So what it actually means is that a woman, just like a man, is down here, but her display rule is all the way up there. So there's an extra amount of effort that ends up being required by a white woman in order to meet the same display rules, or to meet the display rules. For black people, there are social stereotypes that perceive them to be less kind and more aggressive, so their perceived default state is much further down, socially and stereotyped. But their display rule is expected to be at least the same as everyone else's. So what this is asking of them is extra effort in order to meet the display rule. So they are asked for extra effort, which just means that just like a white woman and a white man, a black man has the same sort of default kindness and empathy, below it, but now they're asked to be performing that extra effort consciously. In both cases, these minorities must perform extra effort. For women, it's because the standards are set higher. For black people, it's because the amount of effort that's asked of them is higher. Okay? So I'd like us to reflect on that again. We just introduced how different people perform different amounts of emotional labor. This has been studied as either due to a false baseline or due to extra effort being asked of those kinds of people. So I'd like you to reflect for a second on whether or not you've had a different set of standards asked of you, or whether you've had a different set of standards for how you've judged other coworkers. All right. So I talked about one axis of diversity in each of those experiences. I talked about the difference between a white man and a white woman, and I spoke about the differences between a white man and a black man. That's not how the world works, unfortunately. There is this thing called intersectionality, which is a phrase that was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989, which talks about how there are not only individual axes of oppression and axes of diversity, such as misogyny for gender or white supremacy for race. There are unique interactions with the overlapping and the intersection of these various axes. This is a great thing that I found online. This diagram is a great diagram because it talks about sort of how you can be intersectional when looking at sort of all of your different traits. You can be, for instance, an HIV-positive, married, lower middle class person, and what is the relationship between that person and someone who's a paraplegic, upper middle class African American? When thinking about things like the Nicki Minaj versus Taylor Swift debate, she not only has extra emotional effort asked of her by being black, she not only has a higher standard to attain because she's a woman, but because she's a black woman, there is a third intersecting aspect that asks her to be even kinder, even more empathetic, and even nicer than anyone else. So we just learned about intersectionality, which was coined by Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, talking about the overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination. So I'd like everyone to think for a second about what's your personal intersection, which of those are public, and which of those are hidden. Intermission number 2. So we just sort of dove really deep into a very technical topic, which has been studied by sociologists since 1979. There's a lot of research on this. There's a lot of research on emotional labor. There's a lot of research on how emotional labor relates specifically to minorities. And there's a lot of research about how intersectionality affects the emotional labor that's asked of each of these minority groups. So that was the very technical part. Now is when we're going to talk about how emotional labor relates to pivotal. So I want everyone to remember this diagram that I showed earlier, talking about rules, displays, and emotions. Now, there are different people or different groups which are responsible for changing the standard for each of them, right? So the rules section of it is determined by the place that you work. The company itself sets a company culture which has expectations on how people behave. Your displays are actually judged on a day-to-day basis by your peer group. They're judged by your team members. They're judged by everyone else that you interact with. So if you're going to change the way that people perceive displays, you're going to change that sort of at a social level. The last piece is emotions, which is entirely personal and entirely internal. So we are going to reflect for a second on a lot of the things that we do very well to support emotional labor at an organizational level, at a peer level, and at a personal level. So Pivotal is one of the best places to work for something like this. We have baked into our culture a lot of things which help support people who perform emotional labor. We ask for things like retrospectives, which increase authenticity within your teams. It's almost a sort of, it's a different organization when you're in a retro, which has a different set of rules. You're allowed to be authentic. You're allowed to talk about your feelings when you go into retro. It's asked of you. It's expected of you. We do things like hiring for empathy. Anyone who has experienced the RPI, Rob's parent interview, which is sort of the first thing that you do when coming into Pivotal Labs, has heard that the RPI doesn't select for technical ability, it selects for empathy. And this is something that we actually think about organizationally when we're making our decisions on whether or not to hire someone. We encourage in our company culture things like breaks. Breaks are hugely important, right? It allows you to disengage with a complex emotional relationship that you're currently performing or being asked to perform. It gives you a chance to reflect on that and come back with a different perspective. We offer things like cognitive bias training for all of our managers so that we can prevent people from having those sort of stereotyped thoughts around what kind of emotional labor should be performed by what kinds of people. We have a huge amount of D&I efforts that are going on in the office, currently spanning the range all the way from grassroots efforts to top-led initiatives. That's fantastic because, like we talked about, emotional labor more negatively impacts people who are already of diverse backgrounds. And the Pivotal Pulse survey, which we just got the results back, is starting to talk about things like this. It's starting to expose how we feel at work and how we feel about the job that we perform. Those are things that organizationally we do really well. On a peer group side, has anyone ever added a kitten or a puppy GIF to one of their products just to help them feel better during the day? Yeah. There's a lot of them. So this is actually something that we did on my current team, which is Core Services downstairs. We created an app that shows us the status of all of our concourse pipelines, all of our CI pipelines. And when they all go green, instead of just showing something happy or nice, we put up a kitten GIF. Or we also have a retro board where we put Chillest Monkey. Has anyone ever seen Chillest Monkey? It's something that's really popular downstairs, but I haven't really seen it up here. In the IT space, I don't know if they still do it, but they used to have a giant GIF of Shaq and a kitten just like shimmying at each other. Which is really fantastic because every single time I would walk next to it, I would feel a little bit better. I would feel like this is a place where I can work that acknowledges that I'm a complex human who has complex emotions and doesn't necessarily feel the way that I'm expected to feel at all times throughout the day. It helped me sort of refocus and recenter on the way that I actually wanted to feel. It helped me perform that sort of deep acting that is more functional than the surface acting. We've also done things like installing forced break software. So we have as one of our organizational rules or organizational values breaks. It can be hard to ensure that we take them, right? One of the things that we've done on Core Services and some of the other teams that I've been on, thanks to John, which I know right there, who told us about this forced break software, which will every 15 seconds, this is the default configuration, every 15 seconds, it asks you to take a 15-second break. And it does that by like blocking out your computer screen. So you can't see it.
15 seconds.
15 seconds every 15 minutes, which is great for a stretch, right? Or to take your eyes off. And then every hour, it asks you to take a 10-minute break. And we were really skeptical about that at first. We were like, that seems like a lot, that seems like a whole eighth of your workday. But what we found out was that as we got to the end of the day, we no longer felt so exhausted. And anyone who has worked at labs or at Cloud Foundry and has paired with people knows that pairing is exhausting. And we say that when you come in, we say, this is going to take 3 months before you get used to something like this. But before that, you're going to go home exhausted every single day. And part of that is because when you're pairing with someone, you're performing a lot of emotional labor right then and there. It's a one-on-one interaction, but you're still being judged by a certain organizational rule, and you're being judged on what your public displays are. So forced break software helps you sort of disengage once again. And team outings are another great way to help keep morale, to help people realize that this is a great place to work. On the personal side, I've talked to people about sort of their quote-unquote coping mechanisms or coping skills when performing a lot of emotional labor, and one of them is just to go take really long bathroom breaks. which we can all realize we all do. This is a safer space. And also make sure that you take things like mental health days. So sick days should not only be used for when you're physically sick, but our emotional and mental health is also of equal validity and should be considered in the same light as our physical and physical health. I was reading around, like I said earlier, and I found this in a blog, not a blog post, in an article that was written about Pivotal Labs' new partnership with Ford. And in it, Ashok, who's a PM, said that it's very normal at Pivotal to encourage breaks. That's not necessarily viewed as productive in more traditional enterprise settings. And I think that that speaks a lot to how we do so well at performing emotional labor. So we just learned about what we do as an organizationally, socially, and personally to help support people who perform a lot of emotional labor. And I'd like you to think for a second about whether there are examples of how we do this well, other examples of how we do this well, that you'd like to think about and maybe share later. And how does this relate to other organizations that you've worked in? For most of us, this is not our first job. We've worked or volunteered in other organizations that have a different set of organizational standards and a different sort of different way of allowing people to be authentic and complex humans. So now we're going to talk about what we don't do so well, ways that we can improve, things that are actionable, specific, and kind. So organizationally, so personally, some of the things that we could do better are things like discernment training. So discernment is this idea of being able to defuse yourself from a situation and really take on a sort of objective stance to how something is happening versus fusing with it and feeling it very deeply. So anyone who has to perform a really complex emotional task knows that if you engage with it too deeply, it can burn you. Discernment training helps you take a step back. It helps you make that distinction. There's also deep acting training so that you can better learn how to translate your initial reaction to perform surface acting instead into a more functional deep acting. From a peer perspective, things that we could do better are learning about emotional labor, which you are all doing right now, so yay. One thing we can stop doing is saying, I wish you told me that you had felt that way. Oftentimes, someone comes to us later after having experienced a complex work relationship or not feeling so great. They share that with you, and our initial reaction is to say, I wish you had told me about that earlier. I would like to propose for everyone to say instead, I wish I made you feel comfortable enough to share that with me if you wanted to. The onus is no longer on the person who you're talking to have shared that with you, to have overcome these sort of organizational rules and public displays in order to feel like they can share that with you. I want you to take ownership of the way that you made someone else feel, and instead say, I wish I had made you feel comfortable enough to share that with me if you wanted to. Okay? Another thing that I think we could do more of is sharing our feelings at stand-up. Stand-up is often used, not only our local stand-ups, but sort of our team stand-ups, but especially our team stand-ups. We shouldn't only be sharing the work that we performed technically, because we just realized in the very first part of this talk that what we do on a day-to-day basis is not only technical. We have feelings. We perform feelings work. I would like us to do more of sharing those kinds of feelings at stand-up. Being able to create an environment with your peers that allows you to say something like, I'm not feeling so well today, or I'm dealing with the death of a loved one, or I just went through a really hard breakup. Is there any slack that we can have? Or can we talk about ways that I can still be a productive member of this team? And organizationally, there are a lot of things that we can do better because a lot of the research that has been done has focused on how organizations can do better when helping to support people who perform emotional labor. One of them is vulnerability training. So someone spoke about Invisibilia, which was a podcast that NPR helped produce about a month ago, which talked about how vulnerability training was used with deep sea riggers who were, these big burly men who were out there risking their lives on a day-to-day basis by performing these things on oil rigs. And they had a lot of workplace accidents. And they tried to figure out ways that they could have fewer workplace accidents. And one of the sort of out there ideas that they had was, well, can we change our organizational culture and our peer culture to instead allow these men to express sort of the complex emotions that they're having, to talk to each other more authentically and share the way that they're actually feeling. And they found that it actually reduced workplace accidents significantly, very significantly. I would suggest you go listen to that podcast if you haven't seen it or heard it yet. Other things that we can add organizationally are things like in-house therapy. Now, therapy doesn't need to just be a one-on-one thing. There's group therapy, where everyone can come together and talk to a particular person. There's trauma-specific therapy. There's also things like art therapy or pet therapy, which allow you to sort of get therapy in ways that are not, that don't continue to be emotionally complex relationships. And I think that that's something that we could talk about or think about bringing into our offices. Vacation is another huge one. Vacation tends to be a way that we get away from work, recharge, refill the way that we feel, and allow ourselves to perform more emotional labor in the future. And not only more vacation, but more vacation flexibility. Having the sort of organizational understanding that you might not know that you need to take a day until the day before or the day of. What are ways that we can organizationally help support that kind of behavior? And finally, make sure that we continue to hire clients based on empathy. We hire our people based on empathy. We should hold the clients that we hire to the same standard because they are going to be coming in and working with us as well. They are going to be in our teams and on our pairs. So let's make sure that we hold them to the same standards that we hold ourselves. So once again, we just learned about ways that we can improve socially, or personally, socially, and organizationally, the ways that we handle emotional labor and help support emotional labor. So I'd like you to reflect for a second about something that you can personally take action on to help support your peers who are performing significant amounts of emotional labor. Outro. So I want to come back and talk about and say that Pivotal as a company does way more than the average company. We are one of the best places to work for this. That's why we're doing so much of this already. That's why we were able to find so many things that are already baked into our culture that help support people to perform emotional labor. We are the leaders in this. And I think we want to continue to be. It's right there in our tagline, transforming how the world builds software. And it's the way that people like Rodney, our CEO, talks about the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. So people are looking to us. And because people are looking to us, I want to do this even better than what we're currently doing. We can transform not only the way that the world builds software, but also the way that the people who work for them feel. That's my talk. Thank you. Questions? Yes?
You were talking about vulnerability training that the oil burners went through. What is vulnerability training?
It can span a lot of different things.
Repeat the question?
Oh, sure. The question was, what does vulnerability training actually mean, or what can it represent? So it can represent a lot of different things. In this particular instance, it was a look at how they could allow each other to be more vulnerable emotionally with each other. I don't remember exactly what they did. Sort of the nitty-gritty, but categorically it's sort of a thing that people can do. Any other questions? Yes?
Are there any strategies for making people more comfortable sharing their feelings with you?
Sure. Are there any ways, or are there any strategies for helping people share things with you? So the research finds that authenticity is the easiest way to make people feel comfortable sharing something with you, and some of that comes with you first sharing something with them yourself. So it might be particularly hard, but the moment that you acknowledge to someone else that you are personally going through a hard time, it makes that person much more likely to then talk to you about the times that they're having a hard time. And that is something that we don't necessarily do or talk about from a power perspective. We talk about doing things like that at a sort of peer group level, but what I have heard from a lot of people is that when someone's manager comes to them and acknowledges their own humanness and acknowledges the difficult feelings that they're having, it helps strengthen that relationship and it allows their report to be more vulnerable with them. And they don't often, by the way, they don't often find that it reduces people's valuation of that other person. We don't often find someone becoming vulnerable to us and think lower of them.
Yes, I apologize. I may have missed this earlier in the talk. Are you aware of any research that's been done on the additional emotional impacts from requirements, working primarily with people from other places in the world, working remotely as opposed to co-located?
I have not, actually, but I will look for that. Oh, the question was whether I had found any research about the extra difficulties of performing emotional labor when your team is remote. Actually, I may have found something, so I'll get back to you. Any other questions? Yes.
You talked about like being active. Sometimes like a lot of us are there and come in the mornings and you don't feel like talking to someone or you don't feel like like parent takes this role in terms of communication. Do you have any tips in terms of like if you're in a bad mood say how do you kind of like authentically turn that around such that
Sure, yeah. The question was sort of, yes, we can feel bad, but when we come in during the day, we still have to pair with someone. Are there any strategies that we can perform to sort of both acknowledge that and move forward? I've found that, well, talking about it first off helps. Then the second thing is sort of taking a break or allowing yourself or asking of the other person if you can sort of take a secondary role for a second and then maybe come back to it within an hour or within 2 hours. That's one of the ways that I've found when someone comes to me and says, I'm not particularly feeling well. Yeah.
Yes.
Do you think that there are teams, especially in a cloud environment, that perform more emotional labor than others? I've noticed for a while that, like, police engineering, for instance, is one of the more difficult teams to be on. And it occurs to me that in this context, that might be because they're performing more emotional labor for other teams, because they're often interacting with other teams, driving interactions with other teams, and going to people and telling them that they're maybe something.
Yeah. So the question was whether or not whether I think that some of the teams on Cloud Foundry are performing more emotional labor than others. I think that a lot of the upstream teams probably perform some of the most emotional labor because all of the downstream teams then depend on them. And so any kind of breaking change needs to go out there. Any kind of anger that people feel downstream because you broke a contract now needs to get managed, that kind of relationship. Also teams, I don't have any research for it, but I have felt when I'm working with people remotely, I feel more exhausted at the end of the day, and I think that's because there doesn't exist that sort of physical and in-person way of describing or having an emotional relationship with someone else. There are these sort of like little tics that you do to sort of make someone else feel better that you don't get when all you see is a picture of a person and their voice. Program management. Yeah, for sure. Security team probably right now. Yeah. Cool. Well, I would like to particularly thank Neha for helping me a lot on this talk, and Miriam, and Tim Jarrett, who's my manager, all of whom have helped me sort of figure out the words with which to have this talk. Thank you.